Welcome to WG University Weber Gallagher series of educational programs. This is our Environmental and Toxic Torque webinar series. I am Dean Seaman, and I am presenting today with my co-presenter and colleague Scott Green of First Environment. We are presenting Tank Spills Happen webinar, and we're glad you could attend. If you'd like to view this webinar again, share it with others, or see other WG University programs, please visit the Weber Gallagher website at wglaw.com, and you'll find copies of this presentation and others under the WG University page. Now, there is no live Q&A session, but please feel free to submit any questions to questions@wglaw.com, and of course, Scott and my direct contact information will be present at the end of this, and we welcome any direct questions or comments. Again, this is Tank Spills Happens webinar, a topic that's near and dear to me. I was environmental engineer for 4 years prior to becoming an attorney for the last 15, and have seen plenty of residential and commercial tank spills, misdelivery claims, as well as releases. I've also had the honor of representing the Pennsylvania Underground Storage Tank Indemnification Fund, which handles a host of different risks and claims and issues with tank spills. First, let me introduce you to my colleague here, Scott Green.
Good morning. My name is Scott Green with First Environment. I'm the Director of Insurance Support Services at First Environment. Prior to coming to First Environment, I had the opportunity to work at AIG for 13 years in the Pollution Insurance Products Group, and really as a dedicated engineer supporting claims analysts and underwriters in a technical capacity. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this presentation over to Dean for the residential tank portion.
Well, let's get started here. So of course you have two basic types of storage tanks. You have above ground tanks and underground tanks. The above ground tanks are obviously more visible. You can see them on the landscape. They range from 250 gallons, that's your basic residential heating oil tank, to 5, 10, 25,000 gallons, of course, bulk storage terminals, which we're not discussing today, but you can see the picture of them on the left. And the more notorious of the two tanks is the underground tanks, which is shown on the left. Now, an interesting fact is that it only takes 10% of the combined volume, which either the piping, the accessories, or the actual volume in the tank itself qualify as an underground storage tank. These are more notorious because it's harder to identify spills, misdeliveries, or accidents because, of course, they're underground and have easier pathway into soils and even groundwater. Now, some residential tank statistics. 10% of the homes in the U.S. Have a tank associated with it. And as of 2016, that's approximately 125 million tanks. And rest assured that there's about 10 to 12 million tanks. And they're primarily located in the northeastern part of the country. And that's due to the climate changes and seasonal changes and temperature fluctuations. Now, importantly, residential heating oil tanks are not regulated. They're also associated with older homes, primarily built before 1980. Now, what does that mean? There's less oversight with them, and the tanks can be older, subject to corrosion, more wear and tear, vibration over time, and tank spills can happen in that way when you use them and they're older, as we'll get into later. When tank spills do happen and a claim comes across your desk, here are some basic costs that help you frame the damages here. Your basic smaller spill is around 20,000 or less. This is an easier cleanup, maybe a small excavation. As you see, when you get into impaction to soil and groundwater, you start approaching 6 figures, and your higher end, larger spills are 300 and more. And you can imagine that the more complex claims, as shown on the title page, can reach well above 300,000.
So I'm going to cover the regulated commercial tank area, and I'm going to have a slide here and then some at the end. But just to give you a sense here, you're talking about 560,000 active USTs at about 202 sites nationwide. Uh, Gas stations, service stations represent a large percentage of those. It's around 68,000 operating retail stations in the U.S. It's down from 200,000. Uh, let's give you this will give you a kind of a baseline. So, since EPA kept UST statistics as part of the program in the early 80s, there was 532 confirmed releases. 461,000 of those releases have been cleaned up. And today, there is around 71,000 confirmed releases that remain to be cleaned up. So, some of you may be involved in either cleaning these up or managing the claim associated with these being cleaned up. But one of the takeaways here is, if you notice to the left, 5,000 to 7,000 confirmed releases occur annually. That's a reasonable range, and that range has been consistent over the last 5 years. So, the other thing I just want to leave you with, because tanks have especially most recently been upgraded, prevention measures for leaks have been installed, regulations have come out making those requirements for regulated tank necessary. The number of confirmed release being cleaned up are declining. Each year that 70,000 number gets smaller, and that trend has occurred over the last 12 years.
And to help you visualize what type of spills and misdeliveries we're talking about, this slide is illustrative of small spills and large spills. The small spills are more characterized as accidents, inattentiveness, a little carelessness, a drop here, a drop there. You're walking to grab a hot dog and the gas pump keeps going. However, keep in mind that these spills are generally less than 5 gallons, but can happen continuously over a decade, and they can lead to problems down the road, especially in sandy soils. And remember, the cleanup standards are usually a part per million, so even a cup full or a gallon can lead to significant costs. The larger spills, of course, if you've handled any of these claims or may expect some of these claims in the future, these are claims you don't forget. For instance, to the left, you have an apartment complex basement where there was a spill of heating oil. I mean, you just look at that, that's messy. It's going to be hard to clean up. There's floor drains, other avenues where the oil can spread, leading to further problems. And also another concern that you need to be aware of is loss of use of the residents. Are there misplaced residents? Is there alternative living expenses? For how long? Also, heating oil tends to smell. There's vapor intrusion and odor issues to worry about and not easily remedied. To the right, I love this photograph. This is just a illustration of a unique approach. Instead of demolishing a house or vacating the property, they decided to lift the house off of its foundation, complete a large excavation and backfill, and place the house back on. Creative thinking there. This slide helps you just visualize a common occurrence for tank spills. You have a residence, you have a fill port, and a storage tank to the bottom left. And this is a great picture. As I mentioned, a lot of these tanks are older, a couple decades old, subject to weathering, corrosion. And here's a picture where this tank, the actual metal shell of it is getting thinner, and the product inside is starting to stain and seep through. Obviously, you want to address this, or else tank spills happen. Another issue is that there's water wells and septic systems associated with a lot of homes. Along comes Mr. Fuel Delivery, finds a port, believes it belongs to the AST. However, whoops, spills happen. We just put 500 gallons into a water well. Whoops, spills happen. We just put 500 gallons into your septic system. Well, that's where the next party or individual comes along, the environmental professional at the bottom of the screen, as a claims analyst or just in the energy or fuel supplier company. You want to have a nice relationship with an environmental professional, get them to the scene quickly, as Scott will talk about down the road, and their job is to delineate and identify the pollution, come up with reasonable costs and remediations, and deal with any regulatory issues as well. Also, there's also risk associated with the environmental professional, in that if there's negligence, there may be a claim arising from that. Now, Let's identify some more specific risks associated with the parties I just mentioned. These are some of the more common occurrences of why spills happen. Here you have your fuel dealer and supplier. As we just mentioned, you can fill the wrong fill port. Another issue is there may have been multiple tanks at the property. It can have cross-contamination, or one of the tanks has been removed. Where you thought was a fill port, now just an empty pipeline right into a basement where you can deposit 250 or 500 gallons of oil. Also, that leads to the next issue of you have inaccurate information regarding tank capacity. You go there with the intent of pumping in 500 gallons of oil. Whoops, it's a 250-gallon tank. That 250 extra gallons ends up as a claim on your desk. Inattentiveness or falling asleep is another issue. Sometimes deliveries are late at night, or you get a cell phone call and it's not shut off. So the best thing to do is plan, identify these risks, know them in advance, train your employees, and development of best practices. And of course, as a homeowner or property owner, especially for commercial properties, you want to be knowledgeable of what you're dealing with here. Is it above ground? Is it underground? Identify the risks associated with those two types of tanks. Have proper inspection and maintenance schedules, or get professionals involved. Is the tank old? Is it subject to corrosion? Are the pipes and the fittings correct, or are they, show signs of wear and tear, or valves need to be replaced? Also, today, lucky enough, there's technology that identifies, when the tank is coming to capacity. There's bells and whistles and alarms, particularly in commercial settings. Make sure you have those. Make sure your lines are properly marked and identified to avoid the scenario that we just went through. Another big issue is, be aware if you're subject to floods. We've had situations as depicted in here. This is a nasty scene. What happened here is floodwaters enter a basement, knock your tank off its moorings, tip it over. Now you have oil and water in the basement. You're dealing with loss of use of residents. It's a commercial property, loss of income. You have significant odors, significant cleanups. It's hard to imagine how you're going to clean that up. Also, this warrants consideration of whether this home should be demolished as opposed to, rehabbed. And some risk associated with the environmental professional is, like I said, get them involved in the beginning. Make sure they're qualified and experienced, have relationships, or talk to somebody who has a network of contacts. Make sure that they address proper site assessments and prior pollution, particularly on commercial properties. It's an old gas station where there are prior tanks, abandoned tanks. I can guarantee there was a spill if it's a gas station that's been around for a couple of years or definitely a decade. You don't want to expand your cleanup costs by identifying and encompassing prior pollution in your current claim. Make sure that these professionals are knowledgeable of state and federal regs, depending where you're at and depending on what type of property, whether it's residential or commercial. I both practiced as an engineer and an attorney in both of these states, New Jersey and Pennsylvania, so I'll briefly walk through some of the considerations that mimic other states. In New Jersey, it's more of a privatized system now, where for heating oil residential, you have the UHOT program, which is state accredited people, professionals. They can walk you through the process. There's minimal state involvement, and these professionals, which are pre-selected and available on the state's websites, can help clean up any spill claims. The bigger claims, you have to get an LSRP, a licensed site remediation professional involved. Again, this is even more privatized. They'll complete the reporting requirements and submit everything to the state, which may or may not get involved. Pennsylvania is a little bit different. You have notification requirements. You have to deal with the state. You have to submit and get approval for the state each step of the way. Whether it's a residential, commercial, site-specific, or industrial, there's different types of cleanup standards you can apply for. You have to submit work plans and timeframes and get state approval of those. Just briefly, too, I want to discuss environmental insurance policies. While there's a lot of them, these are 5 that primarily come to play with storage tanks. Here, you have the storage tank liability insurance, which is a specialized policy dealing with people that have multiple tanks, commercial properties. They meet your federal and state minimum financial requirements and have first-party and third-party aspects to them. The next one, fuel dealers insurance. If you're a fuel supplier or insure or manage claims for fuel suppliers, You may want to look into this policy, which is specialized and addresses the specific risks and concerns that fuel dealers face, including broadened pollution endorsements and even emergency response and crisis management. The more common policy, environmental impairment and pollution legal liability. These were around since the 80s to address the absolute pollution exclusion. These can be site-specific, property-specific, address environmental risks, help apartment complexes with business or businesses with business interruption and lost rentals, and are nice to have in place. Two other typical policies are the CPL. You have a contractor doing work on site and they accidentally hit a tank underground or knock an above ground tank over. They can address pollution in those scenarios. And finally, again, if there's negligence, professional liability aspects, you want to maybe you handle claims with professional claims with environmental contractors with E&O coverage, defense costs, and they help minimize any impact to those companies. Again, finally, risk transfer. This is a big hot topic in the insurance industry. I sustained a loss. I have a claim. How can I allocate risk or risk transfer here? These are your key areas. Indemnification. Can a homeowner go after the fuel supplier? Can a fuel supplier go after a product? Was there a product malfunction? You want to consider things like this. Also, contractual issues. Is there contractual liability? Are there additional insured endorsements? You want to identify those at the get-go immediately. That affects joiner of parties down the road. If I join party X, is that going to come back to my insurance policy? It's good to get a handle on those issues early, as well as is my policy primary, secondary, and of course a big one, subrogation. How can I recover some of my costs?
Okay, the next group of slides are going to focus in on regulated tanks, more specifically at service stations, since that is where the largest group of regulated underground storage tanks exist and are tracked under by the EPA. So, this one is an interesting one, having worked on a number of service stations, both when I was with the insurer and when I've been outside the insurer. If you were to ask yourself how of these 170,000 locations, what percentage of those have pollution that would exceed a cleanup standard? Would it be 10%, 50%, 75%, or 90%? And I think you all probably have some sort of an idea there. But the next slide, there's no absolute answer to that. But one study found that pollution was identified in 90% of the cases involving older gas stations. What I've seen over the years, and I think Dean can talk to this too, as many of you could, I'm sure, when you start poking holes in the ground at a service station, it's not hard to find soil and or groundwater that's impacted above the regulatory standard. And that's interesting from an underwriting or claim standpoint. It's not always the catastrophic reliefs that drive these. It's the sale of a facility when the buyer wants to know that there's no liability, and it triggers this the owner's policy because it's reportable to the state. Okay, you hit it. Common pollution pathways. When you look at a service station, is it always a catastrophic release? Often it's not. John Hopkins had pointed this out, that spills happen routinely at sites. You generally don't see these. I've actually experienced only one, but cracks in the pavement are a very common pathway for spills, and it's accumulation over time. These facilities can operate for 30 years, and over time that impact will accumulate in the soil. So some interesting statistics here. So we talked about between 5 and 7,000 underground storage tank releases occur annually, but most people don't realize that 35% of those are from unknown sources, meaning the tank system is composed of a number of different parts, and when these are being reported, 35% of the time, the report indicates an unknown source, which presents a problem for both the insurer and the insured when part of the coverage aspect is demonstrating that there's a confirmed release within the tank system within the policy period. Now we talked about the source unknown, but let's talk about known. 65% of those releases of the 560,000 that have occurred since the late 80s, statistically, the EPA has indicated that 60% of the time, the source is either from the fuel dispenser or the pipeline, not the tank system, not the tank itself. Early on, when it was a steel single-wall tank, yes, the tank had a much higher percentage of the time of leaking. So we just spoke on the source, but as what is the cause? Where does the tank system fail? What's the reason for that? Well, the physical and mechanical damage and accidents. Dean had talked on, I think, slide 4 or 5 about accidents. This photo to the right is I was on vacation down in the Outer Banks and saw this gentleman walk into the get a cup of coffee, and there was some sort of failure of the nozzle, and lo and behold, 10 or 15 gallons of fuel leaked onto the pavement. Often, if you look at your service stations, that the next time you go to fill your car or your truck up, look around. Undoubtedly, you'll see cracks, and that fuel that is being released on a relatively consistent basis will find its way into the subsurface. And when it dries, these are generally not reportable, especially if it's under 25 gallons. And when you're looking for where this system where the system fails, it's difficult many times to use certain lines of evidence to come up with that. So I think I just moved the wrong way. Well, okay. Thank you, Dean. Now let's talk about cleanup costs. Well, cost for remediation for leaking underground storage tanks is driven by 2 major factors: the extent of the contamination and state cleanup standards. For instance, in the state of New Jersey and California, the cleanup standards are much lower than maybe, let's say, Texas or some southwestern states. And generally spills, you'll find that it may be under the SIR, but the average, according to the EPA, is around $130,000 for a confirmed release. Obviously, these storage tank policies, you can exceed the $1 million limit that's generally assigned, and another interesting statistic here is if you were to look at 130,000 being the average, and there's 460,000 confirmed releases have been remediated since the late 80s, and you're talking about $60 billion has been spent on less cleanups. Now, there's going to be a couple photos here of just showing a source and the cause. Here's a claim that I recently worked on. There was a double-wall steel fuel line. This is a containment sump. When the pump kicks on, it allowed vibration. There's some debris in the bottom of the sump, and over time, the Vibration in the pipeline rubbed against small rocks, and to the right you see a small pinhole. That's where the pipeline had rubbed over time and fouled. Once the line's pressurized, it filled the sump and overflowed the sump and discharged, and a notice of claim was submitted to the insured. Spill buckets. Spill buckets. It's where the delivery comes for the fuel. It fills the tank. Spills often occur. This is a containment sump. The fuel drains back into the tank. It's designed to do that. Often these become cracked and damaged. And for instance, in Florida, they're inspected annually. That doesn't occur in most states. It's really upon the owner to really be checking these. We've seen a tremendous number of claims occur, generally low frequency, high frequency, low severity type claims.
I had a quick point here. I mean, these releases, even though there's checks and balances at commercial gas stations these days, I was involved in a pretty significant case in Pennsylvania where it wasn't detected. There's a leak somewhere in an upgraded tank system. And the only way that the leak was found was a water pump shed next door exploded due to vapors. By the time that happened, this plume had spread through a big square mile area and affected a lot of residents. So these are something that must be addressed.
So getting back to unknown sources, fuel delivery and dispensers where spills occur or accidents occur present challenges for the insurer and insured because this is a contributing source of pollution, and a large one at gas stations, especially now. The problem is that these are often unreported, and the evidence is something that really comes out when you're doing your investigation. When you can't find any failure of the tank system, you evaluate multiple lines of evidence and there's nothing with the system that it appears to be failing. Sometimes it points back to the spill. So I believe we have 3 more slides, and what I want to hit on here is leaking underground storage tank customary practices. These are practices you'd expect to see in the field once a release occurs and it's over 25 gallons or a pollution condition is observed in the subsurface. It's a spill notification. It's consistent, I believe, in almost every state that I'm aware of in the United States. You need to notify the state regulatory agency who is handling leaking underground storage tanks or pollution conditions. And the next step, especially at a service station, is a markout. It's required by law that you call in a markout so you understand what utilities exist that come into the property or come into the service station. But it does not mark the utility lines and fuel lines on the gas station itself. This is where a private markout comes into play, and the consultant would hire a capable person to do a geophysical markout. Pipelines are then marked, so when you do your subsurface investigation or your remediation, you're not hitting fuel lines or electric lines or water lines. The next aspect, and I believe all major petroleum companies require a soft dig where you're actually using air to open a hole prior to using a geoprobe or drill rig to collect soil samples. And the other aspect is delineation. It's critical that you define the nature and extent of soil and groundwater impacts. This is critical step to set accurate reserves and to prevent re-reserving. And then once that's done, you can really address your remediation. So this is up here. Unfortunately, I can't. It's a 2-minute video. The technology here won't allow it. But if this is something you're interested, it really takes in a 2-minute clip. Each one of those technologies, it will give you a visual. If you're looking at invoice reviews and you want to know a geoprobe and you've never seen one, or an air knife in operation, Be happy to send you the link and password for this. I mean, this is a claim simulation we provided to 50 claims analysts and underwriters last summer, and it's kind of interesting. Unfortunately, cannot show this today.
This video will be available on the YouTube version, or what's going to be presented on our WG University website, so feel free to access it there.
Let's just talk. This is our final slide. Let's just hit on best practices, and Dean, jump in. But it's been my experience over the years is really get involved early. Don't let the claim finish up where you get a whole pile of invoices and there's questions. I think that is a key takeaway here. Maintain communication with the insured.
That's true. We had a couple claims where the communications have fallen apart, and it's a bad situation where the property owner won't allow environmental professionals on the property. Then there's a lot of mistrust. There's emotions are running high, especially at residences, and you want to keep communications open. If you can't have an environmental professional on the property, you can't clean up, you can't address cleanup needs, and there's no end in sight to damages and remediation efforts.
Verify a confirmed release. We pointed out here they're unknown. A large percentage of the confirmed releases come from an unknown source. Working as a technical person supporting claims and the insurer sometimes, and insured, I mean sometimes, is use multiple lines of evidence. You're going to use your tank tightness test. You're going to use forensic information, inventory records. A number of these put together helps put together the most accurate picture in terms of the confirmed release and the timing.
And remember Scott's slide that 90% of gasoline stations in particular have had prior pollution, so you definitely want to address prior pollution concerns, and you don't want to make a cleanup bigger than necessary.
And delineate impact. I can't tell you how many times that I understand it's important to determine you need a number, gauge a number. I guess you could use 130,000 as an average, but until you can define the nature and extent of the pollution, it's difficult to provide an accurate reserve number. And that is important because no one wants to be reserving, going back to the technical person and saying, well, so why is this cost increasing? It should not. If you delineated it, you can gauge the level of effort properly. Your consultant should be able to provide a good, solid number. And then the last thing, I'll leave this with you, is an exit strategy. If the consultant does not have an exit strategy, and if you ask the question and there's a long pause, you really want to make sure this person or group or team has thought through both schedule and approach to step out of the site.
Well, we thank you for attending our Tank Skills Happen webinar. We hope you enjoyed it, and you can learn more about this program and all other Weber Gallagher events at wglaw.com/wg-university. And again, here's our contact information for Scott directly and myself directly. We welcome any questions and comments. Thank you.
I guess that is a nice segue into boots on the ground. Anytime you can get more involved at the beginning of a claim, and you can have discussion with the insurance consultant prior to them doing it. I mean, let's face it, we've all got claims. They've come in, the remediation may even be already complete. But if you can get involved right from the get-go, I mean, that's why we always say, let's get boots on the ground.
I walk around outside, all of a sudden I'll get a spike. And you can't quite hear the volume on this, but here it is like that. It tones up. And then what happens is as it starts to go down, I know I passed it. I'll bring it back over, and then I keep going back and forth until at that point it gives me a depth reading. Now at that point I know I've located the line I'm transmitting on. I would go ahead and use my paint, put a dot on it, and continue my investigation. I'm going to continue the investigation by sweeping the property with a radar. And what the radar will do is it sends a pulse of energy from the unit into the ground. And when it gets to different dielectric properties within the ground, when there's a composition change, it will send back a reflection and give me an image on my screen.
Now back 15, 20 years ago, that would have taken 4 times as long to do. Now what's in the ground is the 5-foot core barrel with the liner in it, and now they're going to push the next 5-foot core down to a 10-foot depth. These machines have the capability to go down 150 to 200 feet in unconsolidated soil. They can also be used for rock with the proper tooling assembly. And there's a pressure probe, which has a check valve, and it has a spring. This pushes up to 1,000 psi. It's used as a grout also, but in this case, we're using water.